Hello friends, for today's video this is going to be a little bit of a hybrid of things. In part it is going to be a non-spoiler review for a book I recently picked up, a fantasy book, but then additionally I wanted to bounce off of that and have a broader conversation about when it feels as though marketing maybe misses the mark a little bit in how they are approaching a book, how they are presenting a book, and as such, it's maybe not actually finding its target demographic. In a way, my hope is that in having this conversation, one, some of you might actually pick this book up because maybe what you had heard about it, you thought, oh, that doesn't really sound like my cup of tea, but then maybe restructuring a little bit how it's presented, you'll realize, actually, that does sound like something I would really enjoy. The reverse might be true as well. Maybe you will have expected it to have been different, and then hearing a little bit more about it, you'll think like, oh, I would have preferred if it had been like what I'd heard before, and as such, maybe that's not as much for me. As always, the goal when I talk about books is to help people find the ones that are going to work for them, resonate with them, that they'll connect with. So hopefully that will be accomplished. But before we get into all of that, I do want to know, since so much of the discussion today is centered around when it feels like maybe things aren't presented accurately, whether that be through the publisher side of things and marketing, or even how reviewers have discussed them, I want to know, what is a book that you have found completely was different from everything you'd heard about or what you had expected of it, because I'm always very curious when this sort of thing happens. The book that is the subject for this conversation today, though, on my end would be her Hidden Fore. This is a new, what is described as romantasy release, and it is under the YA age range. And I know that YA can mean different things in different places. In the US, where I'm at, it is considered 12 to 18, which is a pretty big age range, if I understand correctly. In other countries, there are actually almost like two versions of YA, one that is the younger end and one is the higher end. This one I would say maybe leans a little bit toward the higher end, and I actually found a lot of the themes that were present in this are things that people who enjoy adult fantasy might actually really like about it. The part that the marketing did completely accurate is the synopsis. So the setup for this story, it is an Irish-inspired world, and you follow this young woman named Aya. And Aya is basically this orphan servant living within this keep. And the family has a very strained hold on their land because of the fact that within their society, there are these notable families, and these notable families have channelers and or keepers within them. And these are the people that have access to magic. Within these families, if after a couple of generations you are no longer showing signs that you can use this magic, then they will put somebody else in your place and you will basically lose your hold on your family home and land. So Aya, while you would think wouldn't have that much skin in the game, she's not from one of these notable families. She is best friends with the young man who is the last person to have a chance at saving his family home. His name is Yanin, and he is going to be facing very soon a testing to determine if he does have access to magic or not. What ends up completely twisting things, however, is that right away, Aya actually discovers at the beginning of the story that she has access to magic, and she is very, very worried that Yanin does not, and she cares about him. She knows that there's so much at stake and how much he cares about protecting his family and everything that they hold dear. So she is grappling with the idea of doing what she would have to protect him in this scenario. And I don't want to say too much else because I think the kind of discovery of that and all the difficult decisions that come with that for her are part of the fun of the initial beginning of the story. But you right away understand that there's a lot, as noted, at stake. You recognize that there is this deep care and friendship between these characters, but it is strained for a number of reasons. And then you are starting to learn a little bit more about their magic system and a lot of the, to put it lightly, gray morality that is present within this. Without going too in-depth about the rest of the plot, I did want to note some of the thematic things and also the books that I personally would consider to be more so accurate comp titles to this book. The comp titles that I'm going to reference are specific to the themes rather than the setting or anything like that, because I think the themes were not only well executed, but were clearly, there was a lot of thought put into them. So the two books that I would compare it to would be Blood Over Bright Haven and Babel, mainly because both of those books at their core are asking the question, do you accept complicity or do you basically burn everything to the ground, metaphorically or sometimes literally? The tie that I think is especially true to Blood Over Bright Haven is that both of the stories have underdog protagonists, and as such, that question, I think, makes things even more difficult. You're not looking at people who were just born into privilege, they've always had privilege, and thus it should be easy for them to actually make some changes, especially if they're the ones holding the power in the first place. Then they're the ones that could wield it in a better direction for all of society. Instead, you're looking at people who have scraped by and they are doing everything in their power just to have some semblance of a decent life. And so there is so much more for them to have to sacrifice when they are faced with these difficult decisions. And as such, I actually found the protagonist of this story to be really likable and really rootable, because she is right away trying to take in how things are, and she is questioning those things. Also, another thing, separate from the themes, just something I liked about this main character, is I think a lot of us, while we appreciate that feisty character, while we appreciate a character that pushes back and fights against inequality or is trying to speak up for the little man, if you will, while we appreciate that, sometimes there's a level of plot armor that comes with that character type, because if they are pushing back against something, you expect there to be some form of trying to silence them or punish them for this. And sometimes it feels like characters can just get away with being mouthy, basically, or really crossing certain lines. And I think part of what made the stakes even higher in the story, or I should say made it more believable, is that our main character, she didn't actually talk that much in the story, but in a way that I found very realistic, because she would kind of sit back and analyze, and she would have to keep quiet to protect herself and sometimes to protect other people as well. And it meant that we were kind of settled with her internally and more intimately, because we're not looking at her just being brash. And oftentimes, I think a good way to categorize the type of behavior I'm describing is ridiculous. Sometimes characters are ridiculous, and you're like, why is this working for them? This would not work for anyone else. And again, if they didn't have the plot armor to protect them, they would have just immediately been killed or pushed out, and they wouldn't even be a part of the story anymore. So I really liked that. I felt like she was very realistic in that sense. And I thought, because she's a young person, that how she dealt with her emotions or how she felt about other people, I felt like those were realistic as well. And I think as a result of that, the YA label is accurate. The themes, as noted, I compared them to 2 adult works, and that's why I think that this book could resonate with a lot of people who enjoy adult fantasy. I still think, though, that it is accurate to have it be YA, because I think it's an accurate reflection of a young person, their experiences, how they are learning to recognize the world as it is. And a lot of those themes, while they can transcend age range, this is something about growing up that a lot of people face. They're realizing maybe the world is more complicated than I thought, and I have people I care about, and if I go against the system, the people I care about might be at risk, or I'm at risk, and having to face that, I think, is something that a lot of young people can really resonate with. So there's a lot about the book that I quite enjoyed. As a side note, also, for those of you that are fans of audiobooks, I quite liked the audiobook as well. But getting to how I think that this is perhaps not perfectly marketed, and of course, it's always going to have some trial and error. Not everything is going to be exactly perfectly what you expected, and sometimes the unexpected is exciting as well. But I think there's a difference between the unexpected and also feeling deceived or tricked. And I don't want to imply, while I am very open to criticizing publishing and marketing when I think they are doing something from an almost insidious angle, I don't by any means think that that was the situation this time around. I think they had the author's best interests at heart. I think they were trying to find who they felt were the target demographic for this book. However, I do think that just analyzing trends and seeing the way that genres have branched out and transformed over the last few years, I think calling this romantasy is presenting it in a way that isn't getting to the core of what it really is. First off, I want to distinguish the difference between fantasy romance and romantasy, which I've done a number of times, but just kind of as a reminder. And some people use these interchangeably, and some people use them the opposite way that I'm going to describe. But the point is still standing, that one of them is where you have a combination of fantasy and romance. It's a little closer to 50-50, maybe 60-40. And then the other is where you have it primarily as a romance, but it takes place in a fantasy world. And that is more like fantasy romance, or at least that's how I describe that, because if you think of it as historical romance, the second part, romance, that's the main genre. The first part is kind of describing the setting. It's almost like an adjective. And then with romantasy, you can think of it as you're combining the two together, and thus the descriptor, the word, is combined as well. As noted, people use these in reverse sometimes too. But the idea is that sometimes there are ones that are pushed together, and the other time it's more emphasis on the romance. I think that calling it romantasy is more accurate of the two. However, I don't even think that that is accurate. I think this is just a fantasy story that, yes, has a romantic subplot, which is why I think it's understandable to call it romantasy. However, I do think that these days people have certain expectations when you say romantasy. In the same way that if you just say fantasy, people have certain expectations as well. And it's okay to challenge those expectations and have books that are genre benders. Like, that's great as well. But I do think there's a difference between that and what's happened here. What's happened here, from my perspective, is that because there's a romantic subplot, it felt comfortably slotted into romantasy. But when I say, for example, a fantasy book that utilizes changelings as part of the focus of the story versus a horror novel that utilizes changelings as part of the story, without even getting into details, for those of you who are familiar with fantasy and those of you who are familiar with horror, you already can probably imagine the kinds of stories that those two things would create. And they would probably create pretty different stories, even though both of them are using something that is fantastical in nature, not real. And also, both of them are utilizing the same thing that isn't real. But despite that, you can imagine that the stories are different because people expect different things of horror versus fantasy. And I think when people hear romantasy at this point, it's not just fantasy with a romantic subplot. There's also something to the pacing and the writing style that has become almost synonymous with the genre. As such, I can see this book being considered kind of slow. I could see even how the themes are presented it's almost like we're taking too long to get to the point, when if it was marketed slightly different, I do think that there's more of a level of expectation that it is going to build into something, or you kind of see it for what it is and you don't necessarily think it is trying to condone some of what is being shown earlier on, because there are moments in this that are pretty bloody, or there are moments within this that there is a lot that is very clearly a moral wrong, you could say. But I don't think it's trying to condone those things. I think it's trying to show a level of complexity, and also it's trying to be thematically focused, but in order to make you care and in order to show the struggle, that takes a lot of time. And that is, I think, a little bit more of the focus within this story. And that, of course, as a result, is going to maybe understandably create this feeling that the book is slower going, and you could almost argue, oh, it's a lot of setup, because romantasy also is very snappy. It's very oftentimes fast-paced. Not always, but from a lot of the experiences I've had reading within romantasy and fantasy romance, it is quite quick. They're very much page turners, and they're also sometimes very entertainment focused. The dialogue can be a little bit over the top, and there is a level of drama to it all. And this one, I think, was a little bit quieter as a result of its themes and of the type of character that we are following. Another factor is oftentimes people expect the plot to move along based on the characters ending up together. And while there are other things that are happening in the background, or there are other things that are sharing space with this concept, at the end of the day, a lot of what is driving you forward as the reader is waiting for certain characters to be together. And while this is a personal thing, I suppose, but I think it's going to be true for a decent amount of other people, I don't think at any point in this story was I flipping the page because I was like, when are they gonna finally smooch? At no point was that the reason that I was moving things along. I was very curious about the magic system. I was very curious about the character's actions and how she was going to deal with a lot of what she had discovered. I was curious about the interpersonal relationships, but not necessarily from a when are they going to be together kind of angle, but more so seeing that there are some cracks and you kind of are analyzing human nature and you kind of even understand where various different characters are coming from and their perspectives. Also, you're looking at trauma reactions because there are some traumatic things that happen. You're looking at class differences within this. And those all were the things that I wanted to turn the page for. And those were the things that built curiosity and investment in the story for me personally. And I think when you say romantasy, you do kind of present to people this idea that you're going to want to turn the page because you do want to see those characters end up together. And this is by no means saying that that's a lesser reason to want to turn the page, because there's a lot that you can say and a lot that you can do within storytelling that is centered in human romantic relationships. I just don't necessarily think that that's what this book was. So I just want this book to find its audience because I think there are going to be a lot of people that quite enjoy it. I liked this first installment. I think where things leave off, it has a lot of potential to become a really cool series. And I already enjoyed the first one, but I don't want to say too much for spoiler reasons, but there's some things that are a little bit more in the background for the first book that I think are going to come to the forefront. And also how things leave off, because it is going to be, I believe, a trilogy. How things leave off, you're like, I don't exactly know what's going to happen next, but in a very exciting way. I am looking forward to seeing what will happen next. Are there some things about it I found a tiny bit predictable? Yes. Are there some things about this that feel kind of familiar to certain other stories? Yeah, it's not like it's reinventing the wheel necessarily, but I still thought it was a solid book. I liked the writing, I liked the world building, I really liked the main character, and I'm looking forward to the next one. But all that to say, the first question I asked at the beginning about what is a book that you feel like maybe reviews and marketing kind of got it wrong, I would still love to know your answer to that. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.